Hello, hello. I'm Rana. This is Evan. And we are here to talk about the super rich and the not so super rich. I think that, aside from the fact that we like each other and we like each other's work, I think you must have asked me to do this because I work at the FT. And half of our readers are in private equity and the other half are socialists, actually.
Yeah, and I think we're both pre-billionaire. I haven't asked about your finances, but I don't think that we're. Yeah, you're not a have-yacht, are you?
I'm not, and please, my husband is a 10-generation Boston Brahmin, and it will horrify him if we talk about money. So,
that's the last mention for the whole evening.
I, however, am descended from Anatolian peasants. So this informs my view about money, which I like and would like to have more of, but also am skeptical about and dubious of. And you feel that way too. And so actually one of the things I want to do, and we'll see if I can balance my glasses that I now need to read and this handheld mic, and read a little bit from your book, which says a lot. I mean, I think we all have our ideas about money that come from our families. And this passage just, I was like, okay, I'm hooked already. So I'm going to read this to you all so you know a little bit about Evan and where he comes from on the money front. I inherited two very different philosophies on money. My mother came from a long line of Midwestern WASPs, and I absorbed some of their threadbare Oxford cloth suspicion of showiness. My grandmother spent years moving from one foreign service post to another, and when I went abroad as a reporter, she warned me that expats have a weakness for accumulating simulated treasure. Don't fill your house with junk, she said. Every mid-century diplomat has at least one cheap ceramic elephant known as a Buffy for big fucking ugly elephant. She went on, all you need are a few fine things. My father's family had other ideas. He was born in India to Polish Jewish refugees who lost everything to the Nazis. His father, one of 7 siblings, was the sole survivor of the war. When he and my grandmother eventually made it to the United States, they scratched their way up. 2 decades later, they paid $40,000 for an apartment, which they stocked with objects that conjured the world that had been devoured by the war: books, carpets, artworks, real and fake. I still cherish a knockoff sculpture known in the family as the fake Giamatti. Money to them meant arrival, grace, and cosmic revenge. I think that is an amazing starting point for a book about the have and have-yachts. So talk about what brought you to this place in this book.
Thank you for choosing that, I have to say, and thank you for having this conversation with me. All of us are, we are the confluence of these headwaters of various kinds that make up our temperament and our preoccupations. And for exactly the reasons you just read, I was aware of the different ways that the American conception of money, which is, let's face it, a central fact of the American idea, and we can talk about all the different ramifications of it, that it has these different pieces of it. And in my family, we didn't talk much about it. I mean, I grew up, my father published books, my mother worked for a human rights organization, but there was this very clear understanding that money was a fact of power. And money was also a measure of your safety and your security and your anxieties and all of the ways in which it would shape your behavior.
The anxiety part is really interesting. New York is a funny place, and I think it speaks to these layers in your book of the haves and have-yachts. I mean, we are living in a new Gilded Age. I mean, all the stats tell us that we haven't had this level of wealth inequality, or frankly, wealth creation at a global level, maybe ever. And there are now sort of anxious layers below those on the super yachts, which we're going to get to in a moment, because that's really my favorite part of this entire book. And you feel that in New York. You feel this sense of, I mean, you and I are at a high level in the publishing world, but probably I'm not alone in saying I fret about, okay, private college for the kids. Can I afford the apartment in New York? This idea of even very well-off people feeling a sense of anxiety is just pervasive throughout your book.
Yeah, I came away with this very distinct impression that the status anxiety is essentially hardwired into us as a species. And in fact, I had reason to go back and talk to these anthropologists and archaeologists who look at income inequality back to the Ice Age, in effect. And they will tell you that there were people It started out because you got irrigation, and then you'd look over at your neighbor and you'd realize, oh, he had better irrigation than I do. I really want to invest in my irrigation. And then, how did he get 2 cows? I want a second cow. And all of a sudden, you begin to accumulate. And there were people, actually. I didn't put this in the book, but I've always loved this fact that anthropologists talk about a specific archetype, which I think we will all recognize, that the very first oligarchs, the first chiefs, were what were known as AAA personalities because they were a little bit more acquisitive, aggressive, and ambitious. And they would get people ultimately to cave to their interests. Does this ring a bell? Does anybody have any? But the truth is that I think that the 2 streams that we're talking about, the kind of instinct to say, I don't want to make money the animating force in my life, and people who say, look, money is a blunt force fact of what it means to be an American, that is very present. That ambivalence and the anxieties around what it takes to actually have a decent life in this country, that is an absolutely immediate issue right now. I mean, there was a poll done last year, and you see this over and over again in the data, that about 60% of Americans will tell you that they think billionaires are making this country unfair. And 60% of Americans will tell you they want to be a billionaire.
You know, it's so interesting. I think it was a Gallup study recently looking at American values, and money is now the top shared value, more than family, more than faith, more than home. And I kind of think that in some ways, I'm just going to, get out there with my political stripes. With Trump, you kind of got the president you deserved in a way, if you think about it that way. This hyper materialistic acquisitiveness, this kind of sense of we're all in it on our own, kind of tearing at the social fiber, Bob Putnam, Bowling Alone. I want to try and connect this book to your previous work, and the way you looked at politics in Wildland and kind of from the bottom up. This is looking from the top down. But tell me a little bit, since 2016, what's changed? What's evolved? What are the sort of points that you would call out historically that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think in some ways, I have, all writers have a few abiding preoccupations of one kind or another. And I keep, the old joke is people write the same book over and over again with different contexts. And when I wrote Wildland, which was rooted in West Virginia and on the south side of Chicago, trying to understand how people had experienced the last 30 years of income inequality, which had become, by every measure, a yawning divide. And I think we know that as an ambient fact. And it's actually part of the problem, is that it's so much just a constant reality. It's like climate change. You're not aware of it every day. And so it needs to be described and written about as clearly as possible. That's why this book felt necessary. I said, I want to describe the reality of this world with the specificity so that someday people could sift through the muck and the dirt and find these yachts and say, what were these things? What were these arcs? What did they represent? What did they mean? And what was the society that created them? You remember, a generation ago, there were 10 of these giant yachts. There are more than 170 today. They're the most expensive objects that human beings have ever owned. I mean, they're more expensive than the most valuable work of art, which was the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci, which, not incidentally, now hangs on the yacht that belongs to MBS.
Okay, so we have to get to the yachts. I'm going to come back to politics and force you to talk about serious stuff, but the yachts are amazing. Just a few facts about the yachts. So some of us may wonder, as we read these stories about these super yachts, how is it possible that they could be $500 million? And you make a point here, which I found fascinating, that to build a $500 million house, you actually get one of these ugly, horrible, McMansion things that make all your neighbors in the Hamptons hate you and have lawsuits. But if you want to build a $500 million boat, that's actually, I won't say right-sized, but it kind of works, right?
It was a Silicon Valley CEO who said to me that, as he put it in the immortal phrase, he said, it's the best way to absorb excess capital. I thought that might be a phrase that captures our period of time. And honestly, that explains why somebody who writes about politics and foreign affairs wrote a book with yachts in the title. It is in its own, it's a symbol of an era, of a set of values, about dominance and greed and liberty and consumption and fairness, and it's all contained it's monumentalized in steel. And if you see it in those ways, then all of a sudden it becomes this text that explains a lot about how people make choices of what they think matters, and how they got there, and how he got into that situation.
So one of the things I love about your writing, your pieces in the New Yorker and your books, is that you put yourself there, and you always do it in a way that's really subtle, really deft, but it adds something important. And you did that very much in this chapter. And so I want to read another bit. And this bit gets at something I experience myself, which is covering the world of the super rich. You sometimes find yourself in these bizarre situations where suddenly you feel a little peeved that your warm nuts haven't arrived in your first class seat,
You're
quite as quickly.
You're stuck with lukewarm.
Yeah, you have what? Just that, how quickly we can become entitled. Okay, I have to read you another bit here. So this is Evan getting onto one of the super yachts in Monte Carlo. The nearest hotel room at a price that would not get me fired was an Airbnb over the border with France. But an acquaintance put me on the phone with the Yacht Club of Monaco, a members-only establishment created by the late monarch, His Serene Highness Prince Rainier III, whom the website describes as a true visionary in every respect. The club occasionally rents rooms, cabins as they're called, to visitors in town on yacht-related matters. Claudia Bathiani, the elegant director of special projects, showed me to my cabin and later explained that the club does not aspire to be a hotel. We are an association, she said. Otherwise, it becomes not that exclusive. Inside my cabin, I quickly came to understand that I would never be fully satisfied anywhere else again. That is one of my favorite lines in this entire book. I just so related to that moment.
I have to confess, you've revealed the actual point of the book, which is the word satisfaction and insatiability. I think that really this is about, where does that sense of insatiability come from? Why is it that you can build yourself a yacht that costs you the better part of $1 billion, and after a couple weeks you could say, I need a bigger boat. I need a bigger boat. And it applies, look, I'll be honest, when my neighbor got a nicer minivan, I was like, I work hard, I deserve fancy things. Like absolutely. A nicer minivan.
I have to say, by the way, while Evan was on this yacht, his wife was dealing with a toilet debacle in their home on the East Coast. So I have to read just one more bit because I just love this and I feel like it captures the psychology, and then we'll move on to some more questions. This is at the very end. Evan is on, I think, the biggest yacht in the harbor. On his terrace, enjoying the latest delivery by the service members, an airy French omelet and a glass of preternaturally fresh orange juice. I thought guilty of my wife at home with our kids, who had sent a text overnight alerting me to a maintenance issue that she described as a toilet debacle. Then I was distracted by the sight of a man on a yacht in the marina below. He was staring up at me. I went back to my brunch, but when I looked again, there he was, a middle-aged man on a mid-tier yacht, juiceless, on a grayish banquette, staring up at my perfect terrace. A surprising sensation started in my chest and moved outward like a warm glow, the unmistakable pang of superiority. Good stuff, good stuff.
Thank you.
All right, so the psychology of the super rich is just amazing to me. We had a conversation once about the rich and taxes. And this gets to a chapter that plays off of an essay you did a while back on how Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a proxy for sort of the traditional Republican base, the kind of Yankee stewards of money that were, conservative perhaps, but solid, good values, how they turned Trump. And at the end of the day, it was about taxes. It was about utter self-interest. How did that happen?
I think there's a story to be told that can be populated with names like Milton Friedman and the birth of shareholder capitalism. And those of us, all the kinds of folks who are coming here tonight, we know some of that story, right? We know on a certain level there was the advent of an idea. And it happened, the concise history from my perspective is, after World War II, after a period in which the United States had this go-go burst of productivity, had this incredible advantage over Europe and Japan, which had been destroyed by war, all of a sudden that gap began to close. Corporate America looked around and said, wait a second, we're losing what has been this extraordinary advantage over the rest of the world, and it must be because of the birth of the regulatory state. And it was, honestly, this is the reason why things like the war against seatbelts and the war against smoking are revealing, because that was the kernel of an idea that eventually kind of flourished into the full-blown libertarian ethic, which argued, in effect, that taxes were not just an inevitable consequence of prosperity, that they were a nuisance and perhaps even an offense to nature. And I think what happened, I sort of watched it happen, that Greenwich is really a fascinating place to study it, because George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush are from the town. It is the absolute paradigmatic example of the country club Republican. Their father, George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, was quite literally the golf champion at the Round Hill Country Club. And he was also then the senator from Connecticut, and he was Eisenhower's golf partner. He was the original Rockefeller Republican, essentially right along with Nelson Rockefeller. And in the years since then, that idea, and he stood for certain ideas. He actually pushed to pay more taxes at one point, he said, in order to fund things like scientific research, education, to make sure that the poorest people are supported. And eventually, his idea, this form of moderate Republican politics, was swamped by something else, which was a much more ultimately profitable and more austere version of an idea that was self-justifying. The idea that actually, to put it bluntly, it was noblesse without the oblige.
That's really interesting. That tracks with my own experience in reporting on the wealthy and on wealth. I remember when my own first book came out, which was about financialization and really the development of this asset economy that has allowed the proliferation of the superyachts and the 15 homes and just wealth of an incredible kind that we haven't seen before. I talked a lot in the book about how Main Street America and actually Main Street business was in some ways having their lunch eaten by Wall Street and the financiers here in the city, private equity. And so I thought that CEOs would be so happy to hear this, and they would buy my book, and they would know that we needed to connect Main Street and Wall Street. In fact, they did not, because 80% of their pay is in stock options. But you know who did buy the book, and who I called to do a lot of speaking to the very highest level of financiers who were looking at the phenomenon that you and I are writing about and trading on it.
Absolutely. Look, I think, when I describe that passage of time, and by the way, I bought your book.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you did.
And it actually, it helped me understand exactly the phenomenon we're talking, which is how did it go from a place where you had, the executives who worked at, let's say, General Electric. This was the prime example. You had these corporations where you would have a senior executive living in town. Over time, eventually, it became dominated by hedge funds. And hedge funds had a different way of thinking about it. And you had leaders at the top who said, look, I am taking the emotion out of this. I don't see myself as connected to the community because the community in this way is very far away. I don't even know where this is. I wrote about at one point in Wildland the experience of a hedge fund in Greenwich that was working on buying and selling coal mines. And these were coal mines that were very far away. It was very hard to picture what they were like. What did it really even mean? These things were an outmoded form of energy production. Are we really going to prop these up? They weren't thinking ultimately about people like David Efaw, to give you just one example, who was a guy who I spent time with. And he once posed the question to me, which is sort of at the heart of what we're talking about, which is that he had discovered that the CEO of a company that was involved in shutting down his mine was paid 400 times what the frontline worker was. And by the way, just to remind ourselves, in 1965, median CEO pay in this country was 20 times what the frontline workers made. It then went up to about 278 times. It's now more or less 300 or 400 times. And he said, sitting in his living room, he said, tell me, have you ever met a man who is honestly worth 300 or 400 other men? Because I haven't.
It's such a great anecdote. So I think a lot about whether we're at a tipping point where we now have a wealthy elite in this country that is just pretty much disconnected from the national interest, period. And you have a chapter on the bunkers that these folks are building in New Zealand. I mean, this was I don't know if you all remember this New Yorker piece when it came out, but it was really seminal. It was at a moment where we all kind of felt that was happening, and you wrote about it. And it's funny because right around the time that your piece came out, I was sitting in a bar in Brooklyn with a friend, and we were talking about kind of the end of the world and what would you do, COVID, Trump, climate, what are you going to do? And my friend said, I bought a motorcycle recently because I thought it would be easier. I could just put the wife and the kid on the back of it. And I was like, well, I thought I lived pretty close to Red Hook. Maybe I could get a boat, like a rowboat or something, and I could just get. And then the bartender turns around and goes, no, what you really need is a motorboat. And I go, wait a minute, you're thinking about this too? And so this, we all have this felt experience of, oh my God, we need to get out of jail or get out of Dodge plan. These 0.001% are building these places in New Zealand. Why New Zealand?
Far away. New Zealand used to say that it succumbed to the tyranny of distance. They couldn't get all the good companies and so on. Now it's their great asset because people want to get far away. I had a CEO of a Silicon Valley company say to me, I keep a gassed up helicopter all the time, and I have an air filtration system in my basement. I think it is an expression of that anxiety you were just talking about. And there's something really interesting that happens when you get too high up in the income scale, the wealth scale. You begin to feel a kind of vertigo, a sense of vulnerability, of exposure. And I remember hearing about a guy who kept a boat right over here, actually, off of Manhattan, and on the boat, there was a surgical theater inside in case he ever got there having been strafed with bullets or something. And at some point it felt like a kind of sci-fi imagined idea of the end, but it was a way of manifesting their genuine knowledge and anxieties that we were approaching a kind of untenability. And I had another CEO say to me, look, he says, we know that, and this was like 6 years ago that he said this to me, that artificial intelligence is going to get rid of a lot of jobs, and eventually that's going to create a lot of anger at us. And that was part of the reason why he was buying what was known as apocalypse insurance. I want to mention something important, which I think is kind of easy to lose sight of, which is part of the reason I'm writing this project, writing this kind of detailed illustration is not because everybody who has $1 billion is like this. In fact, part of this is to point out that there are choices for how to be when you are somebody suddenly who has all of this incredible advantage and resources. I think we've been talking about Warren Buffett recently because he's handing off his business, and I'm reminded of the fact that for years he has said what we all know, which is that it's both logically and morally indefensible that he has a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. And people for a while said, oh, that's great that Warren Buffett's doing it. And it went nowhere in politics. Democrats, Republicans, nobody did anything with it. And he's now gotten to the point, as he says, that the sheer arithmetic momentum of his fortune is so vast. He talks about compounding about every 3 sentences. It is so vast that he has given away $60 billion, but he still has $160 billion left, and he can't give it away fast enough before he dies. This is the sort of the calculation crisis of his life. And there are ways that I think people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Michael Bloomberg, they've done a lot of philanthropy. And part of the reason to mention them is to say right now the landscape is dominated by the Elon Musks, who, let's remind ourselves, the Musk Foundation, it exists. It's a modest operation, but it exists. And for context, he has said that he thinks his greatest gift to humankind is being the CEO of Tesla because of what it's doing on climate change. So he doesn't feel the need to be as involved in philanthropy as the way Gates and Buffett were. At Musk's philanthropy, one of the gifts, according to the New York Times, was to a school that was located in his own home, in which 5 of the 14 students in the first year were his own children.
Oh my God.
So it matters how we talk about philanthropy and which examples are dominating our cultural horizons.
You know, it's very worrisome. I take your point, and I was at Time magazine when Buffett was talking about taxes, and I did a cover story on him. And one of the things he told me at that point, he was very bullish still in America, and his whole portfolio was really about using multinational companies as a hedge on the fortunes of basically as a vehicle to bet on the fortunes of the U.S. pro-U.S. The fact that he's kind of rolling it up now, I think, is very, very telling.
Yeah.
Not just about the moment of inequality, but potentially the fortunes of the U.S. itself. Tell me a little bit about this. Here's
an encouraging fact,
okay.
Actually. Like, I have that same feeling. I think a lot of us sometimes look around and say, gosh, who are the Goliaths who are dominating our culture? And look, they have tremendous power over our lives. That is why I'm writing this kind of book. And yet we've also been through this in our history. This is the good news. We actually have some muscle memory of what it's like to live in a Gilded Age and how to get out of it. At the end of the 19th century, it's amazing to think of it now, you had extraordinarily similar circumstances. You had the advent of new technologies, you had the telephone, the elevator, you had all of these things that were transforming people's lives, but also you had lifespans dropping, because you didn't have medical care to the people at the bottom of society. You had terrible labor conditions, and you had extraordinary concentrations of wealth. There was a feeling at the time that the American idea had sort of ground to a halt. And it was at that moment that you began to have people, some of whom did it because of their faith-based convictions, like Andrew Carnegie, but they started to say, I got to give money back to the system that gave me this fortune. So you had John D. Rockefeller create the University of Chicago. Carnegie, of course, put libraries in small towns across the country. And then importantly, you had elites like Teddy Roosevelt and ultimately Franklin Roosevelt, who became traitors to the class and said, if we want this country that we love to endure and to prosper, it means actually giving up the power that we have in our hands.
But I do take that as we've been here before, we can get out. But I have to say, it almost makes me feel more worried to hear you say that, because I don't see right now, particularly in the Democratic Party, anybody that is as vocal as FDR was, saying, I welcome their vitriol. I want the fight. I see the Democratic Party, unfortunately, as being a party of the wealthy. God knows what the Republicans are right now. But it's a real issue, and I think that we're not grappling with power. And I wonder where you think that's going to come from, or if it's going to come.
I think in the end, it comes from civil society. And this is not a unique American example. There are examples of oligarchies around the world. In fact, as disparate examples as South Africa, the Philippines, Ukraine under Yanukovych after the first invasion in 2014, where you had a civil society movement and it took time, and it gathered and it put pressure on oligarchs. We just have to call them what they are. That is the reality. And it actually does work. The only way that you balance oligarchic power is by diluting and counterbalancing it with citizen power. And the reason why that's significant and why it's worth talking about is, I think the dominant feeling right now is people feel like, I want to do something and I can do nothing. My personal power is a pinprick, and it's useless, except that it's not. The truth is that civil society is a project of sustained attention and commitment. And it can seem as silly as, do I really need to go out to this protest? Does that really matter? But actually, history tells us that protests, labor strikes, and investigative journalism have a way of chipping away at the foundation of corrupt, inept regimes. And pretty soon, sometimes faster than you think, you can bend the curve.
Okay, so before, we got about another 5 or 10 minutes before I open up for questions, but
before the ice storms this building and takes me away.
Exactly. I want to ask you for kind of a prediction, just to follow on from that. I've been really fascinated that people are showing up in Iowa and Utah for Bernie and AOC. You mentioned AI. Looking at the stats, even over the last few months, there are changes in white-collar unemployment, particularly at the youth level. Is this going to collide into the midterms and 2028? Give us some predictions as somebody that's covered politics.
I do think, it was very telling this week that the Anthropic CEO said that he thinks that entry-level jobs are vanishing faster than people realize. And you might ask yourself, he doesn't have any incentive to say this. That's galvanizing the opposition to the embrace of AI. So why would he say it? He's saying it because it's true. And I think that we're all starting to see it anecdotally. If you know people who are coming out of school right now, there are many fewer researchers and editorial assistants who are finding the kinds of jobs that there would have been a generation ago. And that eventually becomes a massively volatile political force. We don't have yet a political vocabulary around AI. It's not an intelligent conversation. And I think we're sort of at the point, though, where we're going to look back on this conversation perhaps in 10 years and say, it's amazing we were doing this. It's like on September 10th, 2001. All of a sudden, there's going to be this dominant force that changes what is in the windscreen of our politics. And I think AI is part of that. But the thing is, it will, in some ways, I think it will accelerate a conversation that has been just off stage about taxes and wages and the way that you come up with a more sustainable economic model so that we can have something closer to the kind of innovative, prosperous 20th century that people have the nostalgic memory for. Because right now, we're not on that path. Just one statistic that can really drive this home. Right now, and bear with me on the zeros here, the top 0.00001% of Americans, which is 19 people, have 1.8% of all of America's wealth. If the same trends continue for the next 4 decades that dominated the last 4 decades, they will have 18% of the wealth. Now, already, the richest people in America have a larger share of the nation's wealth than the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and that whole generation did back then. We are already in uncertain territory. I think that one thing about politics, there's a lot about it that mystifies me. It gets harder for me to understand the longer I do it. But a vacuum doesn't last long, and somebody will figure out that there is an opportunity here. It's grim to imagine it, but remember, Donald Trump didn't exist as a political factor until he put himself in the process. I've been to Sanders rallies recently, and my dominant impression is Sanders is 83. He's probably not going to be the standard bearer of the party. I think AOC actually has a very deep deficit nationally. Her favorability is 18 points behind Bernie Sanders because they've spent years demonizing her and because she is further to the left culturally than a lot of Americans. That means that there may be somebody else who figures out that the language of fighting back against oligarchy is popular and may not actually be encumbered by some of the same issues. And in fact, that person would be extra powerful if they came with the credibility of having said, I've made a fortune, I know how fortunes work.
Yeah, it's a great point. I want to go global a little bit. You spent a lot of time in China. You've written beautifully about China. Rob Johnson, who's a character in your book and was a source on my first book, very interesting man, was a really fascinating character with an interesting window into this world, was a trader for George Soros' Quantum Fund that made his money, got out, became a Democratic activist, and also an R&B producer that I think rehabilitated Ike Turner, if that's
right.
possible. Anyway, very eclectic dude.
That was a long-term project.
That was, yeah. It's like, what's harder, fixing American capitalism or Ike Turner? So he says in the book, he's in your book talking about New Zealand and how these folks that have an incredible ability to predict things and to see patterns are kind of jumping ship. Rob made an interesting observation to me once a couple of years ago. We were talking about the US model versus the Chinese model, and it was around the time that Xi Jinping had announced the anti-corruption campaign, which, I have mixed feelings about. I'd like to hear your thoughts on. But there did seem to be a sense, rightly or wrongly, that the Chinese state had decided, look, we're going to crack down on these oligarchs, and it's the state that has the power. And Rob said it's really important to look at this because whoever's going to succeed, the US or China, it's going to be whoever can control the elites. And I think about that all the time, and I'm curious what you think.
That's such a great observation. It's the amazing thing is Xi Jinping watched what happened in Moscow after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he said, oh, okay, so you're telling me that first what happened is all of these capitalists, cronies, oligarchs, made a fortune. And then, wait a second, some of them came and decided they wanted to be president, and they began to challenge for power, and they began to actually try to take control of the country. And he learned a lesson, which is don't be Boris Yeltsin. And he took from that, and when he says that he and Vladimir Putin, they use this term, it's, by the way, a very funny problem. They use a term in Chinese that is impossible to translate normally in English. The term actually translates as bosom buddies. But try saying that on television to explain U.S.-China relations. It's a little bit of a weird situation. He says, Vladimir Putin understands my mind and I understand him. And what he's really saying is you have to ultimately prevent your country from becoming run by the oligarchs. Vladimir Putin has what the scholars call a sultanistic oligarchy. That's the technical term, meaning that he is the oligarch in chief. The others have consented to make him the sultanistic oligarch. I'll tell you, the people who study oligarchy as an idea will tell you the United States has been, throughout its history, for 250 years, we've been a civil oligarchy, meaning, look, the reality is from the beginning, it was only white men with property who could vote. So this has been a fact of our time, a fact throughout. The risk is at a certain point, if the oligarchs, and the civil oligarchy is defined by the fact that people still think that the rule of law is better ultimately for them and for business than the absence of the rule of law. We're approaching the point now, and this is not my analysis, this is people who study it for a living, that we're edging closer to becoming a sultanistic oligarchy in which you have one person who is essentially, and that's the scene we saw on January 20th. Explain it to me any other way. That's the scene of the oligarch in chief.
That is so interesting, gosh. I want to open it up for some questions. I have many more myself, but if you want to stand up, do we have mics? I can't, let's see.
I think we can probably hear you.
Probably just hear folks. Yeah, just stand up, and there's one here. Yep. Hi.
Between different cultures, like is the Sultan, or not the Sultan, he probably has a yacht too though, but is MBS's yacht, very, very different from Bezos's yacht? And, or is it once you are talking about wealth at this kind of level, these things all just look like, look kind of very, very similar, or are there differences from where these people have come?
That's a really interesting question. And it also makes me think about the fact that I feel like wealth today has more in common globally with itself, whereas it used to be more place-rooted, right?
And I'll restate it for people who are watching on the live stream. The question was, are there kind of anthropological differences from place to place and culture to culture that distinguish one kind of elite aesthetic from another? And the answer is yes. It's fascinating. Look, you can tell I like to write stories through a kind of metaphor, as concrete as possible. One of the ways that I understood what happened to Greenwich was that it went from having these small stone walls, the kind that Robert Frost talked about, to having these giant walls. The stonemasons actually named them Greenwich walls in the area, and they began to pass ordinances in Westchester County against Greenwich walls. Somebody in town actually just named them FU walls, but I take the point. There are, in fact, really interesting differences between these elite cultures, and I remember a guy who was the director of this yacht club in Monaco, who said, he'd done this for about 50 years. He had like his complexion looked like a catcher's mitt. He'd been out in the sun for so long, and he said, he'd started as a sailing instructor, and there he was wearing his blazer and so on, and he said, I've watched each of the generations come. First, there were the shipping fortunes. That was the Onassises and the Niarchoses. And they built yachts and they had some exotic details on them. They were mostly trying to impress Hollywood starlets. And then they had the oil money from the Middle East. And the oil people wanted yachts with good air conditioning because they never wanted to sit out on deck. They were always going around very hot places. And then you got the California people. And the California people wanted everything in a color that could only be described as grayish. This weird kind of Sonoma absence of any pigment. And then now we're into the crypto guys. And I don't know what that is, but I assume it's some weird steampunk thing.
Okay, so I want to build on this question just very quickly before I take a few more. I once met someone who had a business curating objects, rare objects like, you know, that fabulous Buddha head from Thailand. And she would put these things in the homes of incredibly wealthy people who would then be kind of trying to recreate what I always thought of as like the kind of 19th century, I'm a rich English dude who then traveled and found all these cool objects. But actually, I don't have time to do that because I'm working at my third .com startup, and so I'm going to hire some. Like, what is that? It's like the end of experience or something.
I think it is. There's an idea of sort of populating the memories of great experience. People say, you know, fill your life with experiences, not possessions. But maybe you can backfill the experiences. I have occasionally, when staying at a house like that, you know, for some reason, I'll turn over the exquisite, you know, ostrich egg and just see if it has a price tag on the bottom.
Do you snoop when you're in?
I mean, I think we all
I
do.
do.
I think that's part of the reason.
Don't ever invite me to your place because I'm going to be looking in all the bathrooms.
But that's part of the reason why this is interesting. I think material culture as a way of understanding our world is a meaningful way to do it. There was a magnificent New Yorker piece that turned into a book by John McPhee in 1966 when he wrote about concentrated orange juice as the metaphor for mid-century America. Because you remember, concentrated orange juice came about because of the advent of technology that was used for processing blood plasma and penicillin in World War II. They figured out, oh, we can actually sell people orange juice with this same process. And in fact, you could market it, and it could be summer all year long, even in Minnesota. And he made this incredible metaphor of essentially America in a can. And it was both the positives and the negatives. And and I've carried that. Like all New Yorker writers, we are sort of all awed by what John McPhee was able to do. But what I love about it was the way of saying, I'm just writing about orange juice.
Yeah. No, that is I have to say, I bow down. It's the brilliance of the New Yorker format too. Question here in the third row.
Yeah.
We'll just rephrase that for the audience. That the question is, how do the super rich see themselves, and how do they reflect on themselves, or do they?
Yeah, I hope you'll find in the book some of that comes through, because I tried as much as I can to say this is not me peering at it. I'm trying to give it a rendering as they see it. And a few times people were remarkably self-aware. One guy in particular who owns a very expensive yacht, he said, honestly, if you don't feel a little bit guilty, you're a rat. Another one said, if people ever find out what it's really like on these yachts, they're going to bring back the guillotine. And I think that's a kind of self-awareness that is actually quite politically fascinating. It's a kind of, he's gambling with something. He knows that this is a risky proposition. But I'll tell you, he's not selling his yacht. And you know, I think that's, in some ways, you've hit on something really important, which is that there's a kind of unexamined life about this. They become not only self-justifying, but it becomes self-generating. That you do it because, in the same way that, like, you know, look, you get a minivan because that's what you do. People have minivans. And then you get a yacht because you can. I had somebody come up to me after I wrote this piece who had made a big fortune. And this person said, you know, I read that story. It was really funny. And I was thinking, these are so silly, these yachts. And then my husband and I were like, let's go to Monaco and see these things. And then we bought a yacht.
I want to push you a little more on this psychology question. There's two follow-ups that I have. A shrink once told me that the super rich are actually very hard to treat because they do have they can build a reality distortion field. And you have a chapter on Mark Zuckerberg, which I found really, really fascinating, because he is apparently, and I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time of the writing, built a reality distortion field and has told himself that he is not in any way responsible for election manipulation. So what was it like hearing that? Did you push him?
Yeah. I started a series of conversations with him to try to understand, to this point, what was his level of self-awareness? How much was he living in the world that we could see, and how much was he in his own space, so to speak? And what was amazing to me is that you have to remember, as a teenager, he started a company on an idea, and his entire world was then spent in that company of his own creation, handpicking his lieutenants, fortifying his image of what it meant to be a success. He had a concept of what success was, and it meant growth. It meant scale. He used to end meetings in the early years by saying domination. That was always the joking end of the meeting. And then one of his lawyers, once they got into Europe, said, "You may not want to use that term." And the idea of this suddenly awesome responsibility was, to be frank, had kind of completely swamped his abilities. He'd never prepared, he'd never trained, he'd never thought and read about things like the meaning of truth and the origins of violence and the transmission of hate across a society. These were things for which he was plainly unprepared. And yet there was nobody around him who could say as much. Honestly, the most telling detail from my perspective on him that I ever heard was a tiny thing, but it kind of sort of explained it all in the end, was that the reason why Facebook is blue is that he's red-green colorblind. And he wanted to build a world that he could see. And what I realized is that if you build a world that you can see, that means that you have no facility to understand your blind spots, and nobody will point them out to you.
Oh, wow, okay. Question way in the back, sort of on the right there? Yep. Mm-hmm.
You started by talking a little about parents and different sort of approaches to wealth. Just a pure hypothetical. If your mother's family or your father's family had the wherewithal to do so, do you think that they would buy a yacht to absorb their excess power?
I can tell you with some confidence that I think the Jewish side of the family is not so hot on getting out on the water. And the other side doesn't really like loud motors on boats. So I don't think we're cut out for it. Try as we might, I don't think we'll ever get there.
Question here.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but I'm going to preface my question by quoting Steve Bannon, who in a recent interview with the Financial Times said that we live in a capitalist country with very few capitalists, in that the vast majority of Americans virtually own zero assets, and therefore they don't have any stake in the economic system. And, you know, as you guys mentioned, the 20th century, I think it's clear that that led to a lot of political extremism during the time, and we're seeing something similar now. And so that phenomenon I don't think is especially new or unique to Trump. Like, obviously we were talking about Warren Buffett, who has been a generous philanthropist, but ultimately didn't make any effort to challenge the status quo that he criticized. And so to what extent should we see Elon Musk and this new force of oligarchs as a symptom rather than a cause of a new change?
It's a very interesting question. You know, just to kind of shorten and get to the crux, I think what you're saying is that even the super wealthy that have donated, people like Buffett, really haven't challenged the system. Your point about Steve Bannon saying that, you know, that we just have a lot of people that aren't bought into the system at all. They don't have any assets. What does that mean for this new crop of oligarchs, Musk? Where do they kind of fall in that spectrum?
I very much see the Musks of the world, and Trump, frankly, as the culmination of something much more than the cause of something. I'm glad you frame it in that way. I mean, that was, in a way, the purpose of Wildland, especially, was to explain the path that led to Trump. In some ways, I always found the most satisfying books about 9/11 were the ones where the story ended on September 10th. We know what Trump is. We know what he represents. I'm not interested in his psychology. I'm interested in all of the sociological currents that contributed to that. I think that the generation that we're dealing with today of these figures, we'll just use Musk as the symbol of them, they very much are the culmination of a set of ideas. It's a set of ideas about government, and about ultimately their belief that government is a constraint that they can't bear, that it's an insult. I've watched it happen, actually, quite rapidly. This mood has taken hold over the course of the last 10 years. And I think part of it had to do with some of the seclusion we've been talking about. That if you run your own company in which you see everything in the colors you can see, to discover that the public doesn't see you in the way you see yourself, and to discover that the public actually thinks that you've done damage to our attention spans and our democracy, is a kind of trauma. It kind of shakes these guys. And Paul Krugman has a line about it where he calls it something like billionaire derangement syndrome. But there is a way in which I do think that people get shocked by the discovery that when they step outside their own milieu, that they are actually people blame them for things.
Yeah. All right, we have time for maybe one more question right here on the lady on the side there.
That fascinating symbol to me is the yacht. My husband and I crossed the Atlantic in our sailboat and circumnavigated the Med for about 10 years.
Wow.
And the amazing thing is the bigger the yacht, the further out you have to anchor and the further away you are from what you want to see and be in. Is that some sort of a symbol?
That's awesome.
I wish we'd talked when I was writing. I love that fact.
So yeah, farther, more money, farther out you have to go. Actually, maybe I'll just end by asking you about the chapter on the rap stars that play at the bar and bat mitzvahs of the rich. Because I was kind of thinking about, is this mo money, mo problems? I mean, is that like what? Just set that scene for us.
Yeah.
And also, I want to know, as the very last question, if you were going to go back to your own bar mitzvah, who would play?
So that story came about because I have a brilliant editor at the New Yorker who won't allow me to name him, but he was a musician, and he said, I'm always interested in private gigs. Like, what's that economy? What is that like? Why does Beyonce play at a hotel in Dubai for 50 people when she could be in front of a screaming crowd? Look, if the ultimate high for these guys is being in front of a giant crowd, why do it? She got $24 million, by the way, for playing at a hotel in Dubai. So she doesn't need that money particularly. Maybe she wants to give it away. But anyway, I said, let's see if we can do the anatomy of that economy. To which, by the way, every artist who you ask, hey, can you talk to me about your private gigs, says, nope. I don't want to talk about that at all. There's a kind of, it's just below the surface and very hard to, takes a long time to write about, except for Snoop Dogg, who posts all of them online, including one in which he was the DJ at a birthday party for David Sachs, who's now the AI and crypto czar in the White House. And the party was called Let Him Eat Cake, and Sachs was dressed in Marie Antoinette attire. But I digress. So I got one artist to say, yeah, you can come with me. You can embed in my entourage. And it was Flo Rida. And so I went with Flo Rida to a bar mitzvah in Chicago for our first gig. And he didn't call on me for any performance duties, I noticed, actually. I was dressed like this, by the way. I swear I was like, I didn't know what to wear. And I said, should I dress like a member of the entourage? Or I'd finally decided I should dress like an agent. Because that was the only plausible reason I was there.
But you didn't dance.
No.
You didn't get low.
No. I was there like practically with a clipboard, looking like I was auditing the affair. But it was amazing to me. And it was honestly the whole thrust of this kind of work was to just be, I'm a foreign correspondent by disposition and by training. That's sort of what I've always done. And to just go into a world that I might never otherwise visit and try to write down as much as I possibly can and put it on paper. that's hard enough. I can't try to dance.
Okay, you're not getting out of the final question, though. Who would play your bar mitzvah?
The Grateful Dead.
Aw, he's
Well,
a
that's an
good
awe.
guy.
I love that that's an
Evan
awe.
Osnos, I'll ride on your yacht anytime. Thank you. Thank you for writing this.
Rana, thank you.